So, welcome to Letter to Philippi Live. We'll be getting started with our study now as we look at Philippians chapter 2, verse 7. And it's up on the screen there, and I'll read that. And it says, "On the contrary, he emptied himself. They took the form of a slave by becoming like human beings are. And when he appeared as a human being." Let me read that again. "On the contrary, he emptied himself, and they took the form of a slave by becoming like human beings are, and when he appeared as a human being." The Greek word for emptied is kineo. Many scholars understand that Yeshua, in his incarnation, in his coming to earth, emptied himself of the omnipotence, omnipresence, and omniscience of God. The omnipotence, the all-knowledge, the all-power, omnipresence, the all-presence, and omniscience, the all-knowledge of God. Emptying can signify the sinless Savior's sacrificial death when he poured out his life and bore the sins of many. In this verse, Paul teaches that Yeshua, the eternal Messiah, came into the world as a flesh and blood human being, in contrast to later Gnostic groups and the proto-Gnostic teachings of that time, which taught that the man Yeshua became divine, or the divine Yeshua just appeared to be in the world. In this, we see from Paul that Yeshua was one with his creation. He was fully man, he was fully God, entering into our world. And in contrast to the Gnostic beliefs of later times, or the proto-Gnostic beliefs that either said that Yeshua was just appeared to be in human form, or that he became divine at his resurrection. We see here in this hymn, in these verses of the hymn that Paul brings to the people of Philippi here, that Yeshua was eternally God who came into the world as a flesh and blood human being. As Yeshua, God became man and entered into his creation uniquely and intimately. While there have been brief glimpses of the one God of Israel in the Tanakh, interacting with human beings, in the Brit Hadashah, New Testament scriptures, Yeshua is the one God of Israel, empties himself to enter the world fully and encounter his created beings as one of them. As Paul models Yeshua in his life and calls the Philippians to join him in becoming more and more like the Messiah, Paul shares the example of Yeshua's lowly entry into our world and his life of submission to the divine plan as the model for the Philippians to emulate. Let's look here at the next phrase. He took the form of a slave. More than just becoming a human being, Yeshua became a slave. Paul shows the example of Yeshua's willingness to be a slave as one accepting the lowest place in society, entering the world as a baby, entering his world as a humble person, not born in majesty like a great one, but born in humility in a lowly setting in Bethlehem. His willingness to be a slave, the willingness of the Messiah to be a slave, is one accepting the lowest place in society. Interesting, in the opening of the letter in Philippians 1:1, Paul makes the Philippians aware that both he and Timothy were slaves of the Messiah Yeshua. They were ones who were modeling the humility and submission of the Messiah of Israel. They're calling the people in Philippi, these believers in Philippi, to pursue with them being slaves of the Messiah Yeshua. As the slaves of the Messiah Yeshua, Paul and Timothy model their devotion to the Messiah, just as Yeshua exemplified his devotion to us and to the divine plan. In both Philippians 1:1 and 2:7, Paul uses a form of the Greek word doulos, which which Dr. Stern translated as slave in the Complete Jewish Bible. Doulos can also be translated as servant or bondservant. Some Bibles, including the ESV, the English Standard Version, use servant in these verses instead of slave. But these terms are basically interchangeable because most servants were in fact slaves during this historical period. In the shared use of doulos for Paul and Timothy, as well as Yeshua, we see a parallel between Paul and Timothy's devotion to Yeshua as his slaves, and as Yeshua, our righteous Messiah, as the slave of the divine plan of bringing redemption, leading to the Roman execution stake to the cross, and his death as a slave to the plan of God. In this verse, we see the Messianic servant slave laying down his life as an act of dying, as an atoning death, just as Yeshua the Messiah would do. Yeshua is the fulfillment of Isaiah's servant songs of Isaiah 53. Yeshua's humble entry into our world was more than just the one God of Israel entering the world as a man to live amongst and fellowship with the creation. But Yeshua came into the world as a lowly slave, a servant, demonstrating humility as he temporarily left the highest eternal state to assume the lowest eternal state. Next, we look at the phrase, becoming like human beings are. There are two words in Greek, genomai and geneo, that can mean born or become. In this verse, Paul used the Greek word genomai rather than geneo to convey the meaning of a change in status, which is what we see in Yeshua's emptying himself, temporarily leaving his pre-existent divine state and coming to our world as a human being. Other uses of genomai in the Brit Hadashah include the Transfiguration of Yeshua in Matthew 17:2. As they watched, he began to change form. His face shone like the sun, and his clothing became as white as light. In Matthew, genomai is used to describe Yeshua's clothing changing to bright white as he makes his glory known to his closest talmidim. Through the Transfiguration, we can see the coming together of the human and divine in Yeshua. As scholar Albert Nolan writes, Jesus' divinity is not something totally different from his humanity. Jesus' divinity is the transcendent depth of his humanity. Jesus was immeasurably more human than other men. Becoming a man was not a sign that Yeshua was inferior to the Father because of his innate divine status. Though humbled in the incarnation, it demonstrated that the obedience of Messiah is the voluntary, joyful, thankful obedience of his Son, the true sacrifice, transparent obedience of an equal. In this act of humility, Yeshua as divine Lord entered into the world to seek and to save, doing the work only God can do. Thus, the one God of Israel again steps into human history to offer redemption, which only comes from the Divine One. The role of a Redeemer can only be filled by the one God of Israel, as we see in Deuteronomy 10:17-18, which reads, "For Adonai your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, mighty, and awesome God, who secures justice for the orphan and the widow, loves the foreigner, giving him food and clothing." So we see here from this passage from Deuteronomy that the only one to be the Savior, the only one who can stand in that place to be the Savior, is the one God of Israel. So for the redemption of mankind, for the redemption of humanity from sin, it had to be only the God of Israel who came into the world to be the Redeemer. And he did so in the person of Yeshua, our righteous Messiah. Yeshua, as one with the one God of Israel, humbled himself to become a baby born in Bethlehem, to live a life of humility, and to live a life of a slave to the divine plan, a slave to the work of God in the world, and to give his life for the atonement of sin, that he willingly gave himself as a slave, as one totally devoted to his master, totally devoted to his work and the plan to enter our world and to give himself for the atonement, for us becoming anew, becoming redeemed, coming as ones that have the atonement that only God can provide. And we see this in Yeshua, righteous Messiah, that he came into our world in humility, in concert with the divine plan. He came into our world and he became one with his creation. And more than one with his creation, he actually entered in his world for the specific mission of giving his life on the Roman stake, on the Roman cross. That it was for our redemption. It was to bring this salvation and atonement that only God can provide. That Yeshua left his place, the highest place in the heavenlies, to enter our world in humility and to live a life of humility. And as we'll see tomorrow, to give his life in humility, to give his life on the Roman stake, on the Roman cross for our atonement, and to fully live out his being a slave, dying the death of dying the death of the Roman cross, the death of the slave for our atonement. As I said, we'll see that tomorrow in verse 8. As we continue moving, that he humbly entered our world as a baby, became a slave in our world. And we'll see tomorrow that the plan of God included him dying the death of the slave, the death on the Roman cross for our atonement, for our bringing us into relationship with the God of Israel and declaring the debt of sin that has kept people separated from God. Only through the God of Israel, only through the atoning work of Yeshua can the debt of sin be paid and full atonement be offered. So that will conclude our time today as we looked at verse 7 of chapter 2, as we continue our verse by verse study through the Messianic hymn of Philippians chapter 2. Tomorrow we'll be looking at verse 8, where we'll be looking at the continuing work of the Messiah, his death as a slave, the death of a criminal for our atonement. We'll see that tomorrow in verse 8 as we continue our daily study in Paul's letter to the Philippians. So thank you for watching. This is Letter to Philippi Live, a daily broadcast, Monday through Friday, 12 p.m. Pacific Time, 2 p.m. Chicago time, 3 p.m. Eastern Time, 10 p.m. Jerusalem time. And this is a initiative of lettertophilippi.org, a new Messianic Jewish theological teaching organization. And this is our first initiative, this daily broadcast, which we started on June 1st. And we're now on our fourth time going through Paul's letter to the Philippians daily since we started on June 1st. If you want more information about Letter to Philippi, go to lettertophilippi.org. There you can ask any questions you have about us. We have a contact form. You can leave a prayer request. I'll be praying for you. You can read our mission statement. You can watch past class videos. We have those posted online. You can purchase a copy of our Messianic commentary in Philippians on our resources page. You can make a contribution to our work, which we truly appreciate, to continue the work of Letter to Philippi. We are dependent on your contributions to our work. And any other information you want. And as I said, if you have questions, just fill out our contact form. We want to be in contact with you. And you can do that at lettertophilippi.org. So thank you for watching. Shalom. We will see you tomorrow. And as we continue our study, looking at verse 8, which reads, "He humbled himself still more by becoming obedient even to death on a stake as a criminal." And we'll be looking at the continuing work of the humbleness of the Messiah, his humble entry into our world, and now moving to his death, his atoning death on the Roman stake, on the Roman cross for our redemption. And we'll see that tomorrow on our study at Letter to Philippi Live. So thank you for watching. Have a great day. Shalom.